This is the story of America. Seen in color for the first time. America is in the throes of a revolution. It's the swinging 60s. New President John F. Kennedy ushers in a new era.
I don't want the talents of any American to go to waste.
Martin Luther King leads a civil rights battle that promises equality for all.
Our nation can spend billions of dollars to put God's children on their own 2 feet.
It's a decade that plays out on national television. A war in Vietnam, an invasion from Britain.
Oh, I want to kiss one of them. I love them.
A generation embraces love and peace. And an American is the first to walk on the moon. A decade of turmoil brings hard-won triumphs.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
This is the story of the 1960s, as you've never seen it before.
I want us to recapture that.
July 1960. The coming presidential election contrasts two different visions. The Republican, Vice President Richard Nixon, is promising to continue the security and prosperity of the Golden 50s.
Above everything else, the American people want leaders who will keep the peace without surrender for America and the world.
The Democrats choose a forward-looking young senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy.
Kennedy, 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 Kennedy.
I believe we can get this country moving again. I ask your support in this election on November 8th.
Do you want a man for president who sees us through and through?
At 43, JFK is one of the youngest men to ever run for president.
A man who's old enough to know and young enough to do.
His hip approach to campaigning injects a new energy to politics.
I come to the Bronx as an old Bronx boy. I used to live in the Bronx.
But the handsome young senator has a lot to overcome. Voters are unaware he suffers from Addison's, a debilitating autoimmune disease. He's also had 2 major spinal surgeries and frequently needs a back brace. Kennedy is in constant pain. But the Kennedy campaign has a plan to sell him to the country. Now, 90% of U.S. households own a television.
Good evening. The television stations of the United States are proud to provide facilities for a discussion of issues by the 2 major candidates for the presidency.
On September 26, 1960, 70 million people tune in to America's first televised presidential debate.
I'm not satisfied until every American enjoys his full constitutional rights. The reason
JFK is prepped for his television appearance. The day before, he met with producers and discussed camera angles. He looks tanned and glowing.
I don't want the talents of any American to go to waste.
He is wearing a blue suit and shirt to reduce glare and stand out against the gray backdrop.
Mr. Smith, Senator Kennedy, there is no
Nixon
question
looks exhausted. He's straight from the campaign trail and is recovering from the flu. He also has a knee injury, making him appear uncomfortable and shifty.
I wonder if you can explain that, sir.
There is no question but that we cannot discuss our internal affairs in the United States without recognizing that they have a tremendous bearing on our international position.
Mr. Vice President,
His gray suit and pale face appear to blend into the set.
important campaign issue. I'd like to follow Mr.
The visual contrast between the men damages Nixon.
Questions or comment upon one another's answers to questions.
Viewers think Kennedy has the edge, even though radio listeners have the opposite impression. During the debate, Kennedy's on-camera performance makes him look like a leader. And old doubts about his youth are forgotten. Studies will later show that this debate made up the minds of 4 million voters. 3 million vote for Kennedy. Tuesday, November 8th, 1960, is Election Day, and in some places a holiday to encourage voting. 68 million Americans go to the polls. Nixon and his wife Pat vote in the small town of Whittier, California. Kennedy and Jackie vote in Boston. In the evening, as the polls close, the TV networks prepare to bring viewers the results. In Times Square, the famed news-flashing ticker updates through the night. Though the tallies are close, a confident Kennedy goes to bed to await the outcome. Dawn breaks. JFK wins with 303 electoral votes to Nixon's 219.
To all Americans, I say that the next 4 years are going to be difficult and challenging years for us all. The election may have been a close one, but I think that there is general agreement by all of our citizens that a supreme national effort will be needed in the years ahead to move this country safely through the 1960s. So now my wife and I prepare for a new administration and for a new baby. Thank you.
The young couple move into the White House, and in less than 5 months, a new car is delivered. A Ford Lincoln Continental. Original price tag, $7,347. The president loves convertibles. They allow people to see him. But this Lincoln has $200,000 worth of modifications. A bubble top in case it rains. Two-way radio telephones, retractable steps, and grab handles for Secret Service agents. Painted midnight blue to stand out well on black and white news footage, it will travel America with JFK. The image of him in his Lincoln is one of a relaxed leader of the free world. But in his first speech to Congress on May 25, 1961, JFK reiterates the communist intimidation that still looms over America.
If we are to win the battle that is now going on around the world between freedom and tyranny, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
Kennedy is determined to ultimately beat the Soviet Union in the space race. But so far, the Russians have the edge. They were the first to launch a satellite into space, the first to orbit a man around the Earth. And they have stockpiles of nuclear weapons, a dark threat that looms over America in 1961.
What is your main concern? Is it the fallout? Primarily the fallout.
Well, I'm afraid it would be very dangerous to the civilization.
It's taking the chance away from them to live up and be normal human beings.
On October 14, 1962, a United States U-2 spy plane photographs missiles and launchers in Cuba. The weapons are Soviet and can carry nuclear warheads. Cuba's communist leader Fidel Castro has allied himself with Premier Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union. For 7 days in secret meetings, the president weighs the options. An all-out invasion of Cuba, airstrikes on missile targets, or a naval quarantine. He opts for the quarantine. On October 22nd, Kennedy finally informs the nation of the crisis and his plan to handle it.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. The characteristic of these new missile sites include medium-range ballistic missiles capable of striking Washington, D.C., or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
It is now a game of political might between the young president and the steely Soviet leader. Both have military arsenals capable of obliterating the other. Casualty estimates are over 100 million. American citizens watch as the beaches of Key West and southern Florida become the front line of defense. Razor wire and missiles take the place of beach towels and cabanas. America moves the closest it has ever come to nuclear war. October 23, 1962. 9 days since America discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. To prevent war, President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev exchanged written demands by telegram. In the Atlantic, the U.S. Navy stops all Soviet shipping to ensure no more weapons are delivered to Cuba. Reconnaissance planes capture images of Soviet vessels. Intelligence officers pore over them looking for weapons. Beneath the waves, Soviet nuclear submarines await orders to fire. The U.S. trains missiles on Cuba. After 13 days, Khrushchev backs down. He agrees to remove the missiles in return for Kennedy's pledge not to invade Cuba. Kennedy also agrees in secret to remove U.S. nuclear missiles from Turkey. Press Secretary Pierre Salinger presents Kennedy's statement to the world.
I welcome Chairman Khrushchev's statesmanlike decision to stop building bases in Cuba. This is an important and constructive contribution to peace.
The world breathes a little easier as the American military returns home from a war that never happened. Nonetheless, a revolution is coming to America, triggered not by foreign enemies, but by hatred within.
Roll them up, put them in the pan. Some like that and some like that.
African Americans since the end of slavery have been treated in much of the country as a despised minority. They are forced to eat and use bathrooms separately from whites. James Farmer is the founder of the Congress of Racial Equality, known as CORE.
In order to understand how any Negro feels under segregation, you have to realize that from the time of infancy, he has it pounded into him that he's not as good as other people. There are things he cannot do. Don't do this, you can't do this, you can't do the other. It builds into a man a feeling of inferiority, a feeling of frustration, a feeling of resentment.
James Farmer and CORE want Kennedy to understand that segregation stains America's image around the world. CORE wants to test the Supreme Court ruling, long ignored in the South, that bans segregation in interstate travel. The plan is for black and white volunteers to ride together on buses, journeys that CORE calls freedom rides. The riders commit themselves to nonviolence,
I want you to think it over very carefully, and if you
believing that challenging segregation peacefully will force the authorities to act.
we would be very happy to have you embark upon this dangerous, worthwhile, significant mission.
CORE prepares the riders for the racial hatred they can expect.
Hey, you, nigga. You hear what that man said? You hear what that man said? You get back there. Get back there. Get back, get back, get back. Excuse me. Hey. Come on. Come on, get him back.
On May 4th, 1961, James Farmer leads 13 people, black and white, onto buses in Washington, D.C., bound for New Orleans. Ten days later, the bus enters Alabama, home to the largest KKK organization in America. They know the riders are coming. In Anniston, the Klan surrounds the bus, slashing its tires. Photographer Joe Postolione captures these images. The crippled Greyhound tries to escape, but a few miles out of town, the Klan surrounds and firebombs it, with the riders still inside. The Freedom Riders do escape the bus, only to be beaten by the Klan. Joe's photos bring the Freedom Rides to international attention. Over the next 5 months, 400 volunteers ride through the southern states. The attacks continue. Despite breaking no federal laws, riders are arrested on trumped-up charges, simply for using segregated facilities. With the nation and the world watching the Freedom Rides, JFK's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, steps in. He orders the Supreme Court decision on integration to be enforced everywhere.
I think the Attorney General has made it clear that we believe that everyone who travels, for whatever reason they travel, should enjoy the full constitutional protections given to them by the law.
After nearly a century, the signs in the South start coming down. Whites-only toilets, drinking fountains, waiting rooms all start to be integrated. It's a major victory for the civil rights movement, but it is only the beginning. In the South, discrimination against African Americans remains ingrained.
Our arrangement does not allow us to serve niggers in here.
A year later, segregation is still firmly in place in Alabama. The new Democratic governor, George Wallace, resolutely resists racial change. He makes a defiant pledge in his inaugural address in January 1963.
Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
But African Americans in Alabama have had enough. In spring 1963, in the state's largest city, Birmingham, they stage nonviolent demonstrations. Wallace responds. Protests are banned. Those arrested forced to pay high bail. Then, America's most prominent civil rights leader comes to Birmingham. April 12th, Good Friday. Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy lead a march from the 16th Street Baptist Church. They are arrested. It is here that King pens his now celebrated letter from Birmingham jail, defending the resistance of African Americans. In solitary confinement, he writes, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." The letter becomes a touchstone for the civil rights movement. He is released on bond a week later. The Birmingham campaign continues. On May 3rd, local news anchor Harry Mabry uses his home movie camera to capture this never-before-seen footage. He is filming as the police turn dogs and fire hoses on the protesters. Kennedy sends 3,000 federal troops to Birmingham to restore order. Governor Wallace bitterly resents federal intervention in his state. On June 11, 1963, he stands in the doorway of the University of Alabama to physically stop black students from entering. Wallace is challenging a Supreme Court ruling that struck down school segregation 9 years earlier. The powers of the state and federal governments collide on national television.
Do hereby denounce and forbid this illegal and unwarranted action by the central government.
Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, representing the Kennedy administration, attempts to enforce the law.
They have a right to be here, protected by that court order. I'll ask you once again, will you give me the assurance that you will step aside and peacefully do your duty? Very well.
Katzenbach retreats to make a call to JFK. Kennedy's response is to immediately federalize the Alabama National Guard and order them to remove their own governor.
And it's my sad duty to step aside under the orders of the President of the United States.
The two black students, James Hood and Vivian Malone, enter and begin their education. The immense national attention brought by the escalating civil rights movement pushes Kennedy to take an historic step. He delivers this speech the day the black students are admitted.
I hope that every American, regardless of where he lives, will stop and examine his conscience about this and other related incidents. This nation was founded on the principle that all men are created equal. Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
JFK wants to ban racial discrimination in schools, workplaces, and public facilities, the boldest civil rights law ever attempted. Two months later, JFK's official photographer, Cecil Stoughton, captures a relaxed president and his family off the coast of Massachusetts. Jackie is nearly 8 months pregnant with their son, Patrick. Just days after this footage is taken, he is born prematurely and doesn't survive. A grief-stricken JFK throws himself back into the battle for civil rights. August 28, 1963, the March on Washington, the largest demonstration ever seen in the nation's capital. On the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, King tells 250,000 people that he has a dream and calls for the end of racial discrimination. Justice for all. Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill is now before Congress. Historic change is within his reach. But to make it last, he'll need to win re-election. He needs to ease tension with Southern Democrats in states like Texas, where civil rights reforms are still unpopular. In November, he plans a 2-day, 5-city tour of the state. JFK and his wife land in Dallas, Texas at 11:30 a.m., November 22, 1963. It's Jackie's first public appearance since the loss of her baby. The presidential limousine SS-100X is there to greet them and take them the 10 miles through town to the Trade Mart, where the president will speak at a luncheon. Despite a forecast of rain, Kennedy wants the bubble top to be open. Home movies and TV cameras capture the excitement. Thousands line the route. A radio newsman reports live.
The president's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the Trade Mart. I was on Simmons Freeway earlier, and even the freeway was jam-packed with spectators waiting their chance to see the president as he made his way towards the Trade Mart. It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
November 22nd, 1963. For the first time ever, network television is interrupted.
Here is a bulletin from CBS News. First reports say that President Kennedy...
Caught off guard, it takes CBS News 6 minutes to get their cameras on the air.
This is Walter Cronkite in our newsroom, and there has been an attempt, as perhaps you know now, on the life of President Kennedy.
An hour later, Walter Cronkite breaks the news to the nation.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
For the first time, a national tragedy is reported live on TV. Within 2 hours, 92% of Americans know their president is dead.
It's a state of unbelief. Nobody quite believes exactly what's happened.
I think it's one of the saddest things that's ever happened.
To me, it's a shock, a disgrace for the whole nation. It's a loss that I feel that we will feel for some time.
Monday, November 25th, JFK is laid to rest, with millions bearing witness around the world. President Lyndon B. Johnson pledges to continue what Kennedy started.
No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long.
The grieving nation supports Johnson. The new president overcomes a 75-day filibuster by Southern senators. On July 2nd, 1964, the Civil Rights Act becomes law. Racial discrimination in schools, employment, or public places is now illegal. On February 7th, 1964, Pan Am Yankee Clipper Flight 101 rolls into JFK Airport. On board are 4 musicians from Liverpool, England. 3,000 American fans have turned out to greet the Beatles.
Paul, Ringo, George, John. Can we have a last John.
Their single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, has just hit the top of the American charts, where it will stay for 7 weeks.
Not true.
Their British humor charms the hordes of reporters.
Did you hope to get a haircut at all? No, thanks. I had one yesterday. That's no lie. It's true, too.
Their mod suits and bowl haircuts give them a rebellious look. They're adored by the girls.
I want to kiss one of them. I love them.
Boys are equally enraptured by this new sound and style. On February 9th, hundreds line up to see the Beatles on The Ed Sullivan Show. And more than 73 million tune in to watch. They play concerts in Washington, New York, and Miami before returning home on February 22nd. The Beatles embody the youth revolution spreading across America. A new generation is pushing the boundaries of culture, society, and technology. The baby boomers are growing up, and in 1964 are the beneficiaries of an economic boom. More than 32 million families, 60% of the country, own their own home and at least one car. But thousands of Americans are shunning this consumer lifestyle. A counterculture is emerging, and its nucleus is in California. It opposes political and social norms, believing peace, love, and personal freedom can solve the world's problems. A bold belief, as California in 1965 is the country's second most populated state, with Los Angeles the most crowded city and one of the most racially diverse. Decades of immigrants from Asia, Latin America, and the internal migration of African Americans from the South makes LA a melting pot of culture. Just 5,000 police officers patrol this 400-square-mile city. This training video highlights the new tactics they adopt.
The surprise appearance of a specially equipped, disciplined police unit early in the action will often be sufficient to dominate the situation. You can usually rely on the progressive employment of your riot formations, the baton, smoke, and tear gas to break out most civil disturbances.
But that toughness comes at a cost. Increased tension with minority groups. Complaints of racial discrimination and police brutality grow.
You're stopping us on the street, kicking in the doors, taking down the police station, you're kicking your teeth in.
August 11th, 1965. The fire of resentment ignites in the African-American neighborhood of Watts. At 7 p.m., officers stop 21-year-old Marquette Fry for reckless driving. His mother comes to the scene and a crowd quickly gathers. The situation begins to escalate and get out of control. A riot breaks out. Fires spread. Rioting and police clashes continue for the next 3 days. By 1 a.m. on August 14th, there are 100 fire crews in Watts trying to control the blazes. Curfews and mass arrests take place across Los Angeles. "3,000 National Guardsmen join police to restore order. When it is all over, 34 people are dead, 1,032 injured, nearly 3,500 in jail, and there's been more than $40 million of property damage. Watts is just one of hundreds of protests and police clashes in America in 1965. America is at the height of a revolution. But a different revolution is on the horizon, one of love and peace. It's 1965. For the past 5 years, America has built up a military presence in South Vietnam. In response to Communist North Vietnam's threats against their southern neighbors, on March 2nd, America launches its biggest military deployment in a decade. Operation Rolling Thunder. The U.S. is now attacking the enemy's homeland, which President Johnson says is justified.
Over many years, we have made a national pledge to help South Vietnam defend its independence, and I intend to keep that promise.
But the bombing will last not for weeks, but for another 3 years. In 1965 alone, over 230,000 troops are drafted. One famous young American eligible for the draft is heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali.
You can look at me, I'm loaded with confidence. I can't beat me. I had 180 amateur fights, 22 professional fights, and I'm pretty as a girl.
Ali, a Muslim and pacifist, says he cannot kill people in Vietnam. On April 28, 1967, as a conscientious objector, he refuses the order to join the army.
Well, whatever the punishment, whatever the persecution is for standing up for my religious beliefs, even if it means facing machine gun fire that day, I will face it before denouncing Elijah Muhammad and the religion of Islam.
2 months later, Ali is convicted of draft evasion and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Boxing authorities strip him of his title and ban him from the ring. But he avoids jail by appealing to the U.S. Supreme Court. By the fall of 1967, the U.S. troop level in Vietnam is closing in on 500,000. More than 100,000 have been injured, and 15,000 Americans are dead. America is split. Half the country supports the war, believing it is vital to contain communism and advance freedom around the world. But the other half, they oppose the draft and the surging death toll among troops and civilians. They say the war is illegal and immoral. Demonstrations across the country bear witness to the growing unrest. Martin Luther King Jr. supports the protests. He denounces channeling so much money to a futile overseas effort when so many are suffering at home.
If we can spend $35 billion a year to fight an ill-considered war in Vietnam, our nation can spend billions of dollars to put God's children on their own 2 feet.
1 year after this speech, on April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, just after 6 p.m., a shot rings out. On the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, Martin Luther King Jr. is hit. King's companions, Jesse Jackson, Ralph Abernathy, and Billy Kiles, point toward the shot as the civil rights leader lies dying. Once again, the nation is thrown into grief. But after a decade of strife, something potentially unifying beckons. America is very close to putting a man on the moon. November 1968. In yet another of the decade's stunning turns, the man elected president is the same man Jack Kennedy defeated in 1960, Richard Nixon. He wins a tight election. America is ready for change.
We want to bridge the generation gap. We want to bridge the gap between the races. We want to bring America together. And I am confident that this task is one that we can undertake and one in which we will be successful.
But 8 months later, the generation gap is still plain to see. Joe LeMay is 21 and works for the Eastman Kodak Company in New York. He and his wife Valerie have a new baby girl. August 15, 1969. The LeMays join 500,000 young Americans heading upstate. Organizers of a 3-day festival of peace and music are racing for a new venue after residents of Ulster County shoot down their plans. A dairy farm in the Catskills becomes the new site, but they stick with the original name, Woodstock. Joe shoots this footage, never broadcast before, of the climax of the counterculture. In the summer of 1969, America is at an all-time high. A month before Woodstock, the nation experiences one of the defining moments in human history. July 16th, 1969.
10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engines
Ignition running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Americans crowd highways and beaches to witness the launch of Apollo 11 from the Kennedy Space Center. On board, astronauts Michael Collins, Buzz Aldrin, and Neil Armstrong.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
From the Oval Office, President Nixon watches along with 600 million people worldwide.
We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to...
The biggest TV audience ever at that time. On July 20th, the world sees the first men, Americans, walk on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Hello, Neil and Buzz.
From the White House, the president congratulates the astronauts.
I just can't tell you how proud we all are of what you have done. For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives.
The promise John Kennedy made at the start of the decade has been fulfilled. America has won the space race. It is Americans who show the world the view from the moon. The past 10 years have brought revolutionary changes to America. The nation has confronted racial division and a new chasm between the generations. Great men have died, but the promise of lofty ideals still binds the nation together, no matter how loosely. And the 1960s become known as the dawn of modern America.